Well, our speaker tonight is a Mack Cox, is quite a collector. He reminds me of our last speaker. You all will remember the last round table we had with the Cassius Marcellus clay. Well, the fellow who gave that talk is a very good friend of our speaker tonight. And they're both kind of much alike in that they're great collectors. Mack is a collector, an independent scholar of early Kentucky material. And this is not weapons, this is furnishings. It's portraiture. And he has, and his wife have, amassed a remarkable collection of early Kentucky material. Again, furnishings and portraiture. And so vast is this collection, and so important is this collection, that by 2013, the magazine Antiques, a lot of us have seen the magazine Antiques, described the collection as one of the finest assemblages of antebellum Kentucky material anywhere in America. Now that's kind of an amazing thing to come out of Antiques magazine. Mack right now serves on the Henry Clay Memorial Foundation Advisory Board. He serves on the advisory board for the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. That acronym is MESDA. He has featured, he's lectured on Kentucky furniture and portraiture all across Kentucky, as well as before the Decorative Arts Trust of Philadelphia, MESDA, Colonial Williamsburg, Historic Deerfield in Massachusetts, a winter tour in Delaware, and Washington, D.C. Decorative Arts Forum. So he is well-versed in the decorative arts, early decorative arts in America, and principally in Kentucky. His talk tonight is An American Story, the Red Family Paintings. Without further ado, I want you to give a warm welcome to Mack Cox.
Hey, y'all. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me? Are we good? It is wonderful to speak to the Kentucky Civil War Roundtable. I thought about this for a long time. Kent is correct. My wife and I are collectors of early Kentucky material. We usually do a lot of research with those things. And sometimes the stories become epic and saga-like and amazing. And this is one of those stories, and it's about this painting right here and a group of paintings that were owned by this lady as well as her family. And you'll sort of get that notion as we pass through the talk. And I think you'll find it's amazing that that painting even exists. This advertisement for a rare portrait auction in 1934 marked the end of a Kentucky arts treasure that is worthy of rediscovery. The auction was in Lexington with portraits by Jouett and Frazer. Morrison Chapel was the venue, which is in Morrison Hall at Transylvania University. Jouett was Matthew Harris Jouett, Kentucky's most celebrated antebellum artist, and Oliver Frazer, who was a generation later. He was the most important Kentucky artist of his era. 16 portraits were listed, 5 by Jouett, 6 by Frazer, and 5 by other artists. 3 were of Oliver Frazer, and 1 was of his father, Alexander Frazer. There was Rebecca Redd, who is beside me, who was a sister of Jouett's wife, and their sister, Elizabeth Mitchell, and her husband, Dr. Mitchell, and their children, Alexander and Martha Mitchell. Martha grew up to wed Oliver Frazer, the artist, and he painted her and their children in 1849. So the paintings in the cell were relatives of both artists, and this is how. The Allens had 3 daughters. Elizabeth married Dr. Mitchell, Margaret married Jouett, the artist, and Rebecca married Waller Bullock Red. The Mitchells had a daughter named Martha who wed Oliver Frazer, the artist, and they had a daughter named Kate. The Reds had a son named Oliver Frazer Red after the artist, and after the death of his first wife, he married Kate Frazer, the daughter of the artist. This marriage consolidated into one home the family paintings of the Mitchells, the Reds, and Oliver Frazer, which I call the Red family paintings. So the portrait auction was family art of Matthew Harris Jouett and Oliver Frazer. But we are getting ahead of the story. Jouett was born in Kentucky in 1788, and this was his boyhood home. He went to Transylvania University in 1804 and graduated in 1808. His campus was very different than today. Then the principal building was a 2-story federal home that had been used since 1792. 8 years after his graduation, a 3-story federal structure was built nearby, and the space in between became the College Square. It burned in 1829 and was replaced in 1834 by Morrison Hall, a Greek Revival building that stands today. After graduation, Jouett began practicing law in Lexington in 1809. In May 1812, he wed Margaret Allen in a double wedding with her sister and Dr. Mitchell. Later that year, Jouett joined the Kentucky Volunteers for the War of 1812. He was already a self-trained artist, painting portraits while in college and sketching fellow soldiers during the war. Jouett returned to Kentucky in 1815, a warrior, attorney, and artist, but was determined to paint and opened a Lexington studio. His early portraits show raw talent and have certain traits. The heads are centered and often distorted vertically. Most heads and shoulders are at similar angles to the canvas and face the viewer's right. Wanting more, Jouett went to Boston in 1816 and trained with Gilbert Stuart, who was then America's preeminent artist, and Jouett returned to Kentucky a very different artist. The methods learned can be seen in these unfinished works by Stuart on the left and by Jouett on the right. Both boards were prepped with a model gray and white. Sketching was done with a brush and paint rather than a pencil. The subject was started vaguely as one is seen at a distance, upon which details were layered. In the finished portrait, there is detail in the face, but not in the hair or clothing. The eyes calmly connect with the viewer and from a height with more powerful sitters. Jouett learned that skin is translucent and could be simulated with thin layers of tan and peach over a model prep. He now highlighted lace with standing white, which is a paste of white mixed with turpentine that rose above the canvas. In short, Stuart made Jouett a master painter. And this is his middle period, ranging from about 1817 to 1824. Most paintings of this period are limited to 2 compositions. This is the most common for ladies, with a vertical head and the shoulders at a high angle to the canvas, which is repeated in these ladies and these. All the heads are vertical and turned at a similar angle. This pose was used for his mid-range portraits, with the head slightly tilted, the shoulders at a lower angle to the canvas, and with a sensual neckline, like these ladies and these. All are posed the same and all lack hands. His high-end paintings have hands, which were difficult to paint. Some have multiple subjects and some are original compositions. And there were other poses like these 2 ladies. The most common pose for men is the same as for women, with a vertical head and the shoulders at a high angle to the canvas, like these men and these. None have hands, and this was Jouett's standard pose for either sex. Most sit with their back erect, but a few are slumped on a chair with an arm hung over the crest rail, which is a more casual pose. Extra large men were often posed like this. These were his high-end 3/4 length portraits of men, which have hands, and examples of unique compositions. Most children were 3/4 length with hands and either sitting or standing. The extra background with children is often filled with a landscape or a prop. He painted Henry Clay, Kentucky's most important statesman, which he sold copies, and Kentucky's most important artist himself, and varying copies. He copied Stuart's Washington and Jefferson and Ary Scheffer's Lafayette, then sold counterfeits in Kentucky. But Isaac Shelby, Kentucky's first governor, is a Jouett original. Jouett's paintings began to change from about 1825 until his death in 1827. Eyes may or may not engage the viewer, and there were new compositions and looser brushwork. This was his late period, which moves towards the Romantic style. Had he not died at age 39, he might be known today for this style of painting. Jouett's Lexington studio was behind the old courthouse and likely in this building. His home was several miles north of Lexington, which Jouett painted about 1818. His home studio is on the left. It was a large 1.5-story room with large windows for lighting. 2 ladies and a toddler are on the porch. Perhaps they are Peggy, Jouett's wife, Rebecca Allen, Jouett's sister-in-law, who was given the painting, and Gilbert Stuart, Jouett's son, who was named after the Boston artist. Oliver Frazer took a different path. He quit school at age 17 to become an artist. His father, Alexander, died when he was 2, and his uncle supported him. Frazer trained with Jouett from 1825 to 1827, and his early paintings reflect this training. His uncle bankrolled more instruction with Thomas Sully in Philadelphia in 1828 and in Europe from 1834 to 1838. In a nutshell, these are his influences. He returned to Lexington in 1838 and opened a studio. The European experience dramatically changed his paintings. which is his mature style. These are examples of Frazer's women, Frazer's men, and children, at which he excelled. The Anderson children on your right is among his masterworks and was painted a year after his return from Europe. Sir Thomas Lawrence, the British artist, had a lasting influence. Frazer copied his portrait of Lady Gregg while in Europe and adapted the composition about a decade later for his wife and children, which is quite different than his typical layouts. Samuel Redd was a Lexington coachmaker who sent his sons to Transylvania to become lawyers, including Waller Bullock Redd. He was a classmate of Jefferson Davis. During an 1825 banquet for Henry Clay's law class, Redd made a toast. Here is to Jefferson Davis, may he become the pride of our country and the idol of our army. Waller began practicing law in Lexington. In 1831, he wed Rebecca Allen, and they began raising a family. By 1838, they had 4 sons and purchased a home on a small farm that adjoined Jouett's widow. The Redd home has been called Vaucluse, Eothen, and Malvern Hill, but we will call it Eothen as Oliver Frazer named it 2 decades later after a book titled Eothen, Traces of Travel from the East. Eothen was built in 1798 by Reverend Moore, the first president of Transylvania, as a parlor with 2 chambers and a recessed porch. The parlor was nearly square with 12-foot ceilings and designed by Moore for acoustics and string music. Kentucky author James Lane Allen adapted Reverend Moore, Eothen, and its parlor for his fictional story titled The Flute and the Violin in 1891. About 1800, the porch was closed in for a hallway, and later the house was joined to the kitchen for a dining room. The Redds added a classical porch after 1838 and a wing after 1850. Eothen has charmed the public since, from the 1930s to the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1980s, and so on. In November 1838, the year Oliver Frazer returned from Europe, a son was born to the Redds and named Oliver Frazer after the artist. A month later, the artist wed Martha Mitchell, Rebecca's niece, and they lived in a cottage that adjoined Eothen. 5 years later, Rebecca's husband died, leaving her with 4 sons, but she managed to keep Eothen and raise her boys. By 1857, Rebecca had a significant art collection that hung at Eothen, including 4 Jouetts, one of her mother, one of herself when she was single, her sister's home that was next door, and her sister. She had 4 Frazers, one of Richard Hickman Menifee, Jouett's son-in-law, her father-in-law and sister-in-law, and her husband, painted just before he died. They were not just paintings to Rebecca, they were her life and connections to her past. But the present was pressing. Her father-in-law passed, and her boys were now men and full of adventure. Along with her younger brother, James Allen, they wanted to sell out and start again in Missouri. So in 1857, Rebecca packed up her past and sold Eothen to Oliver Frazer and her niece, who now had 5 girls. The Redd boys moved out, and the Frazer girls moved in. This photo of Ethan was taken about that year with the Frazers out front, including Oliver and his wife Martha and their daughters. For the Reds, the move was perhaps 1,000 miles. They might have taken a train to Louisville and then a steamboat down the Ohio River, up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers to Boonville, where James Allen got off. Then another 100 miles to Dover, where Rebecca started over. Her farm was several miles west of Dover, and there were friends nearby, like Joe Shelby. He came from Kentucky about 6 years prior, where his stepfather, Benjamin Gratz, and Rebecca Redd were friends. In 1858, Joe wed Elizabeth Shelby and built a fine home called Mount Rucker. The Civil War began in April 1861, and by June, Shelby and Rebecca's sons had joined Southern forces. In August, the Union ordered martial law in Missouri, and in September, the first battle of Lexington occurred, and that's Lexington, Missouri. With Rebecca's sons, who were combatants, her home was 8 miles away, and she could hear the cannon. By June 1862, Mount Rucker was torched by Kansas Redlegs, a pro-Union gang, and Elizabeth Shelby and her baby moved in with Rebecca. Elizabeth's husband became General Shelby, a legendary cavalry commander. Rebecca's son, Oliver Frazer, became Shelby's aide-de-camp, and her 3 other sons were under their command. In August of 1862, Shelby was moving towards Dover with his cavalry, but his scouts found it occupied by Union infantry. So they stopped at Rebecca's, and she prepared the men a meal while their horses grazed in her pastures. They described her as a lady more truly hospitable and more heroically Southern than many of the far South's daughters. Rebecca was a target for punishment under martial law. She was taxed for having sons in the Confederate Army. Assessments averaged $5,000 in today's dollars, and if one could not pay, their property was sold. This was a huge sum for a widow of 20 years and with her sons away at war. Several times the Union threatened to burn her home, and often as many as 25 soldiers would appear and demand a meal, which she dared not refuse. Order 10 came in April 1863. Now one was jailed for aiding a rebel and banished for having a father, husband, brother, or son in a Southern force. Banishment meant one was expelled from their home and the Union in 15 days. So the families of Southern soldiers were made refugees. 10 girls were jailed under the order in a Kansas City building, which collapsed on August 13th, killing 5. One survivor was found shackled to a ball and chain with both legs broken. She was age 13. At the same time, William Quantrell, a Southern bushwhacker, was preparing to attack Lawrence, Kansas in response to Order 10. News of the prison collapse fueled the violence when they attacked on August 21st. They murdered 150 civilians and burned the town. Order 11 came 4 days later, which depopulated 3 Missouri counties in 15 days. The houses, barns, and crops were burned and the livestock killed. About 25,000 were made refugees. Most were women and children, and about a third were loyal to the Union. George Caleb Bingham, a Missouri artist, wrote that, "If you execute this order, I shall make you infamous with pen and brush." And he did with this painting. The location is 30 miles west of Rebecca's house. And to paraphrase Bingham's account, men were shot while obeying the order and their wagons seized. The exiled moved southward while wagons extended for miles, moving Kansasward, loaded with stolen furniture and apparel. Dense columns of smoke rose in every direction, marking the burning homes. They were crowded by the hundreds along the Missouri River, hoping for a steamboat to take them to safety. Order 11 required strict enforcement of Order 10, which banished Rebecca for her sons and Elizabeth for her husband. They were first banished from the Union, but Joe Shelby used his connections to change the order to Kentucky. He also got Benjamin Gratz, his stepfather in Kentucky, to travel to Missouri and escort them home. Rebecca packed her paintings in a wooden box padded with bed clothing and moved the box to a small steamboat landing called Berlin. When a boat came, there was no room for possessions, so she had to abandon the paintings, including this one, on the bank of the Missouri River in open air, at almost exactly the location shown on this Google Earth image. About 100 miles downstream, the boat stopped at Boonville, Missouri. Rebecca found Lizzie Cope, her niece, and begged her to find the paintings and keep them safe. Then returned to Kentucky, where she stayed with the Frazers at Eothen. Lizzie Cope found the paintings and got them to Boonville. The box had been opened and the bedclothes were stolen, and the paintings damaged. The worst was Rebecca's mother, which lost a part of the panel, but it was amazing that they survived at all. Lizzie lacked room, so she moved them to James Allen's home in Pilot Grove, who was Rebecca's brother. Within 9 months, Oliver Frazer died at Eothen. They buried him under a tombstone with a palette and brushes. His personal art remained at Eothen. Martial law was declared in Kentucky on July 5, 1864, with General Burbridge in charge, who was known for executing Confederate POWs. He attempted to banish Rebecca about February 1865 per a telegraph to Robert Jefferson Breckinridge, which reads, "If you have any influence with General Burbridge, will you not use it to prevent Aunt Rebecca Red from being driven a second time from her home and friends? She comes under one of the brute's last orders." Lincoln removed his authority the same month. A year later, the war ended, but Red was still Shelby's aide-de-camp, and rather than surrender, Shelby led 1,000 horse soldiers to Mexico City, where they met with Maximilian. Shelby offered his troopers as a foreign legion, but was refused. Instead, they were granted land for a new Virginia colony near Veracruz. Shelby and his men are known as the Undefeated for never surrendering, and the title was used for a movie. It takes generations to come to terms with Civil War, but Captain Red began that process about July 1st, 1865, and made a long ride home to Kentucky. He arrived by August 10th, 1865, in time to know his mother's last wishes. "Get our family paintings and take care of them. They are all I have left in this world." By 1867, Red was working for Richard Jouett Menifee, a grandson of Jouett. Menifee had a portrait of his father that the Bath County Courthouse wanted, but he said no. Red owned a better portrait in Missouri and offered a deal. If Menifee would move all his paintings back to Kentucky, then he could have this one and give his to Bath County. The Jouetts, who now lived in Louisville, went to Missouri, but only packed 3 paintings. Menifee's father and Rebecca Redd's mother and sister then returned to Kentucky. Captain Redd let him keep his until he had a place for them. 3 years later, Redd married Maggie Warren, and they lived near Lexington. In 1877, Maggie died after having 3 children. Later that year, Redd married Kate Frazer, a daughter of Oliver Frazer, the artist, and the only one to wed. This is Eothen about 1900. Out front are Mrs. Oliver Frazer and 2 daughters. Kentucky artist Samuel Woodson Price wrote in 1902 that Eothen is so picturesque that one is struck with its appropriateness as the abode of an artist. Mrs. Oliver Frazer died there in 1903. About 1905, Captain Redd and Kate returned to Eothen, which was the childhood home of both. Redd returned the paintings from Missouri and hung them on the same walls that they had graced nearly 50 years before. Eothen's art now included Oliver Frazer's European practice works and family portraits, paintings by other artists, the Mitchell portraits by Jouett, and the Redd paintings, except for the 2 that Menifee had kept. Menifee had since died, and when Redd inquired, the family said no. They had kept them for 38 years, and they now owned them. So Redd filed suit, but lost the paintings based upon possession. Even so, Eothen was an astounding art gallery that highlighted 2 Kentucky artists. The curators were Kate Redd, who was Frazer's daughter and Jouett's niece, and Captain Redd, Frazer's cousin and Jouett's nephew. The interpretation was organic and all about family. Some photos exist, like this one of the parlor, which had most of the art. Waller Bullock Redd was above Rebecca, and over the door was Madonna with Child and Saints, a Frazer practice work after Titian. There are 2 written descriptions with enough detail to imagine walking up to the front door and into the entry hall, which had French hunting prints, rifles, and swords on the walls, and into the parlor with 12-foot ceilings. A period description called it a place of incomparable atmosphere with portraits everywhere. Oliver Frazer by Healy hung over the fireplace, and to the right was Waller Bullock and Rebecca Redd. Above the piano were portraits of Oliver Frazer and his wife by Healy. To the right again was a Frazer self-portrait, his wife and children, and Joseph Ficklin by Samuel Woodson Price. Then the Mitchell portraits by Jouett and Samuel Redd by Frazer. The parlor held 15 paintings, and through the door to the dining room, you could see the landscape of Jouett's home. It was unframed and hung above the kitchen door. The fireplace had paintings by Bessie Frazer, Oliver's daughter, and to the right was Bessie Frazer and her dog, Cedric, by Oliver Frazer. On the opposite wall were 3 paintings over a sideboard, including Alexander Frazer by Jouett and Catherine Redd McDowell by Frazer. Captain Oliver Frazer Redd died at Eothen in 1916. He was buried in the Lexington Cemetery with a tombstone that bears the stars and bars. His death was widely reported in the newspapers, all stating that he never gave in, that he escaped to Mexico with General Shelby, and that he never swore allegiance to the Union. He remains undefeated and an everlasting rebel. His second wife, Kate Frazer, died at Eothen in 1921. She was the last of Oliver Frazer's daughters and was buried next to her husband. Some in this audience will recognize Colonel Dick Red and his horse Major, who for nearly half a century after the Civil War led parades and other events, both locally and afar, and was widely known for his rebel yell. He was Richard Menifee Red and the youngest of Rebecca's sons. He was a private throughout the war, but became a Kentucky colonel afterwards, and claimed that rank until his death in October 1932. He lived at Eothen in the latter years of his life with his niece, Fanny Red, who was a daughter of Captain Oliver Frazer Red, and his second wife, Kate Frazer Red. The month after Colonel Red's death, Fanny Red was fatally injured in a car accident at age 50. She was the last of the Red family to live at Eothen. Her estate was complicated by the uncertain value of the art and an underage beneficiary. In 1934, a judge ruled to auction the paintings, and ads of a rare portrait sale filled the papers. It was held at Morrison Chapel in Morrison Hall at Transylvania University. 16 paintings from Eothen were crowded on the stage, and the power bidders began to arrive. There was Lee Nally, who was Rebecca Red's granddaughter and E.J. Nally's wife. Nally was a big deal. He had been vice president of Postal Telegraph and Marconi Corporations and was the first president of RCA Corporation. Lee Nally grew up with the paintings, already had a Frazer self-portrait that had come from Eothen and had traveled from New York to buy the rest. But it was the Great Depression, and she was limited. There was Miss Batchelor of Virginia. She sent an agent to buy her ancestors, the Mitchells. Other bidders included the Speed Art Museum and a lady called Mrs. Coca-Cola by Lee Nally. The auction made the local paper, which detailed the results. Lee Nally bought 6 portraits, including her grandparents, step-grandparents, and great-grandfather. Later that year, Eothen and its furnishings were auctioned. Frazer's student works, the Jouett home painting, and paintings by Bessie Frazer may have sold at this auction or perhaps left before the sale. Like the Jouett home, Marie Trapp Brooks sold it to Catherine Turner Antiques about 1966 and included a note stating it had been in her family since it was painted by Jouett. She lived about a mile north of Eothen at Greendale and was Oliver Frazer's granddaughter. So we know the provenance, but we don't know if it sold at the Eothen auction or if she got it earlier. Or this Patrick Henry, after a Lawrence Sully miniature, which Nanny Frazer sold in 1916 and is now owned by Colonial Williamsburg. Lee Nally attended the Eothen auction. She acquired this classical secretary and sugar chest, 4 French hunting prints, and other items. The hunting prints were likely Captain Red's, as he was an avid fox hunter, but the secretary and sugar chest were likely Oliver Frazer's, the artist, as the Reds lost everything but the paintings in Missouri. Lee Nally had her paintings and other items packed and shipped to Bronxville, New York. She was a great steward, creating records and placing copies in the Frick Library. She told her grandchildren stories about the paintings and willed them to Mary Lee Hahn, her daughter. Reflecting on the sale, Nally wrote to her daughter late in life, "Within some of us there persists sentiment so deep that it remains with us till death. My one thought was to keep them together, but I couldn't afford to buy them all. She advised her daughter that if they must be divided, then split the Frazers to one and the Reds to another to keep the families together. Lee Nally died in 1959, and the paintings went to Mary Lee Hahn, who had 3 children, so she knew they would be split after her. Per her mother's wishes, when she died in 1992, she willed the Frazers to Ann Hahn, who died in 2005, and then to her daughter, who sold them in 2008 at Northeast Auctions in New Hampshire. Mary Lee Hahn wanted the Reds to go to Rick Hahn, her grandson, but that meant they would pass through her son, William, who led a cavalier global life unsuited for the portraits. And we have an issue. And I think it might be my computer. Try something here. Right. Okay. I don't have more.
I got some. Can you get you some?
Sure. And I'll continue with this just for what it's worth. So we are talking about William Nally Hahn, and he's in the center, second from the lowermost portrait. Thank you. And William, she did not want the paintings passing through William because he led a cavalier global life unsuited for the portraits. And we are still not transitioning. Okay. He was a B-17 pilot in World War II, and this is him in his plane. His plane was named Nine Yanks and a Rebel. After surviving 25 combat missions, he got to go home in 1945, like in the movie The Memphis Belle. Do you recall Air America, about a Vietnam War airline that was covertly owned by the CIA? They flew material into Laos for a proxy war with civilian pilots and various aircraft, including the short takeoff Pilatus for steep mountainous runways. A privately owned competitor called Continental Air Services flew similar missions with William Hahn, who ran Continental from 1969 to 1978. This Pilatus on the ground in Laos in the 1960s was under Hahn's management at that time. He was a man of adventure, not art. So Mary Lee Hahn willed the red portraits to Mary Lee Merritt until her death, and then to Rick Hahn. In 1999, Mary Lee Merritt lived in Connecticut in this home. She wrote about Lee Nally, her grandmother, which I've condensed. One of her great pleasures was taking me and my sisters around her Yankee Land home and talking about family portraits. She would collect us and open a drawer where rolls of mints were stashed like coins, dole them out, and then settle down. The best part were the old photos. My favorite was Ethan, with the walls filled with portraits. Then Mary Lee looked to her own grandchildren. When they notice the portraits, I will be patient. Let's go out and you skate a while, and later we'll open a roll of mints and look at old photos. 2 years later, she was killed in a car accident in Virginia. Per her mother's will, the red portraits went to Rick Hahn, a commercial fisherman who lives in California. In his own words, Rick was raised to believe that the red portraits were part of his heart and soul, and he was married under the approving eyes of his grandparents and his great-great-great-grandparents, Waller Bullock and Rebecca Red. He had the painting shipped with a truck going through Manhattan on 9/11/2001, just missing the World Trade Center attacks, but arriving safely in California. Rick thought about the future and wanted the Reds together in Kentucky and in the public eye. Fishing for that person, he posted Samuel Red on eBay in 2011 with impossible terms. I offered alternatives and asked if he had anything else from Kentucky. He did. He had 4 portraits and wanted a phone conversation. Googling my name, he found this story revealing that we owned a painting that his cousin had sold. To Rick, it was his grandparents' painting, who taught him to keep the portraits together. He believed our eBay encounter was divine intervention. We came to terms, and the paintings returned to Kentucky in a wooden box, much like the one Rebecca used when banished. The night before crating, Rick did an all-night vigil and emailed, "I am struggling through this morning and am now physically ill with grief." The paintings arrived, and I emailed Rick this photo so that he knew they were safe and together. We have shared them with the public in 2010 at the Hopewell Museum in Paris, in 2014 at the Bluegrass Trust Antiques and Garden Show, in 2015 at Colonial Williamsburg, in 2017 at the Speed Art Museum, in 2019 at the Jack Jouett House and the Filson Historical Society. In 2020, Mel Hankla, who spoke here last month, allowed me 25 pages in the signature edition of his book titled into the bluegrass to preserve the story in print. In 2021, they returned to the Hopewell Museum for an exhibit by Estill Curtis Pennington to celebrate his book about Jouett. And later that year, Rebecca visited the Madison County Historical Society in Richmond. And tonight, she has returned to Lexington to be with you, the Kentucky Civil War Roundtable. This is Rebecca's hometown and where Matthew Harris Jouett, her brother-in-law, painted her portrait. The Red family paintings speak louder as a group than individually, so we have pursued them and now have 9. They are the family art of Matthew Harris Jouett and the personal art of Oliver Frazer, 2 important Southern artists. They have traveled from the bluegrass to the Midwest, to the Mid-Atlantic and New England, from coast to California and back to Kentucky. They have experienced war and peace and have descended in a family whose stories parallel American history. They have swirled around a magical place called Eothen, the home of Oliver Frazer and next door to Matthew Harris Jouett. And from 1905 to 1934, they were assembled there by close relatives of both artists, and we know how that looked. It was a place so picturesque that the visitor, on first seeing it, was struck with its appropriateness as the abode of an artist. Thank you. And if we want questions, I'm happy to take questions. Mel Hankl's book, the signature edition, some of you probably have his, a few might have this one, but it was a leather-bound case book that sold for more, and he wanted to add a little bit more to it, but to help fund the printing cost. And I have a copy over here if anybody's interested in looking at that. And then I'll start with the most prominent number. Yes?
Where is Eothen located? It looks very similar to Rose Hill.
No, Rose Hill is a much larger geometric federal home. Eothen is on Old Georgetown Pike, almost directly across from Nandino Boulevard and the post office, except there's a wall of trees. Okay. And it was recently, well, several years ago, it was remodeled. And so it still exists, it's still there, it's still magical.
Is it in a private home now?
Yes. If you go past the post office, at a point on the left, you'll see an electric gate, and that leads back to it. There's 2 homes behind that electric gate. Yeah. You had a question?
That's what I was going to ask you, the location.
It's difficult to get to, but if you wear a ninja outfit, you can make it. Yes.
Now, what are the red paintings now? They're all together?
Not all of them. I mean, we own 9. There is a living descendant of the offspring of Oliver Frazer Red, and it's the Gateskill family. And they've acquired a number of these paintings through time, 2 self-portraits and some other portraits. There are many that are at large, and some have been lost, but we look for them every day.
Dick Red, wasn't he the guy who got on the horse and rode around Stall Field?
Yes, yes, sir. And did the rebel yell? Who can do a rebel yell? Kent? Any more? Yes, hey.
His father, Jack Jouett, was an A famous then as the Paul Revere of Virginia.
Paul Revere of the South. There was a pretty nasty British general during the Revolutionary War. Was he a general? I'm trying to think. He was named Tarleton. And he was going to capture Jefferson at Monticello, and they stopped the evening at Cuckoo Tavern in Virginia. And Jouett's father was sleeping in the yard, and saw them come in and figured out what they were doing. And he made an all-night ride and warned Jefferson.
He captured Daniel Boone, didn't he?
I-
That same night, that same day.
Did he?
Yes, he did.
I-
Daniel Boone was captured in Charlottesville because he didn't get out of town quick enough like Jefferson.
Well, I've made the argument that he saved Boone as well, but apparently not. I didn't know that.
He was captured.
But it also saved the armory. It would have been devastating to the cause if Jefferson had been captured, I mean, for sure.
And that house stands, and is a museum, Jack Jouett House.
Yes, the Jack Jouett House is in Woodford County, and it's owned by Versailles, and yeah, and you can go visit that, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful visit. Hey, yes.
What year was this painting painted?
About 1818. This was not long after Jouett's return from training with Gilbert Stuart, and Jouett had married her sister, and so he's painting his sister-in-law before she's married as a young, beautiful lady.
One other comment. You mentioned about Moore, the first
Yes,
president of Pennsylvania, Reverend Moore. He was called to be the rector of Christ Church and then became president of Transylvania. So he was elected as the first rector of Christ Church, the Episcopal Church on Market Street, and then became the president of Transylvania.
He didn't spoil the rod. Or spare the rod, excuse me. Yes.
Tell us about this painting on that side.
He was the president too.
I know that painting from a long time ago, and it's Townsend, who was an early historian here, and you know, he's just well published, and he's among, you know, the founding fathers of Kentucky history, if you will, in his era for sure. And that's related to the Civil War Roundtable. That's not my painting. I'd like to have it. Any more questions? Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure.